President Trump promised that he would wage a war on fraud at his State of the Union address, and now those plans are coming into focus. A new executive order calls on nearly a dozen benefits-paying agencies to come up with ways to reduce fraudulent payments. Vice President JD Vance will lead the task force. Federal News Network's Jory Heckman joins me with more details. Jory, thanks for joining me.
Hey, Terry. Great to be here.
All right, let's dig into the details. Which agencies are on this task force, and what will they be doing?
Yeah, so in no particular order, this task force will have the Departments of Treasury, Justice, Agriculture, Labor, Health and Human Services, Housing and Urban Development, Education, Veterans Affairs, and Homeland Security, and also will have the Small Business Administration and the Office of Management and Budget also in that task force. And broadly speaking, what they'll be doing is they'll be working together to come up with a national strategy to stop fraud, waste, and abuse within federal benefit programs.
Do they have a number target that they're going after?
That can be a squishy thing to nail down. There's a figure out there from the GAO and IGs of the world on improper payments, and that's not exactly a one-to-one. Improper payments includes all number of payments. Some of them are overpayments, some of them are underpayments, but the Government Accountability Office has nailed down an estimate of the fraud number, and that is somewhere in the neighborhood of $233 billion, upwards of $521 billion annually lost to fraud. But at this White House signing ceremony of this executive order on Monday, White House officials suggested that the task force could actually recover more money than what GAO estimates. White House Staff Secretary Will Scharf said that this could recover billions or tens of billions or even hundreds of billions of dollars. And Deputy White House Chief of Staff Stephen Miller went beyond that and said that this could be an effort to ultimately recover trillions of dollars. President Donald Trump said that the recovery of these funds really would be a country-changing amount of money, said it could do things like address the national debt and ultimately lower taxes for a lot of Americans.
If we found half of the fraud that's taking place in this country, and I think you have a chance of doing that, we would have much more than a balanced budget. That's the kind of numbers you're talking about. The theft is incredible.
Those numbers are pretty ambitious. What kind of problems are they starting with?
Yeah, so we heard from Vice President JD Vance, who will be leading this task force. He said that as the fraud czar appointed by this executive order, he would really make sure that agencies primarily are on the same page, that they are on the same wavelength when it comes to, seeing end-to-end fraud investigations be prosecuted and come to an end.
We started to figure out one big hole that existed is that the agencies of the government weren't actually talking to each other. So Treasury would have evidence of financial fraud, but wasn't talking to the Department of Justice about it. Health and Human Services had evidence of Medicaid fraud, but wasn't talking to the Department of Treasury about it. So what this executive order does is force the entire apparatus of the federal government to do two things: stop the fraud in the American taxpayer and make sure that the benefits that ought by right go to American citizens and not to fraudsters.
Jory, how are they going to actually do that? Do they have some near-term goals?
Yeah, so within the next 30 days, the agencies on this task force, they are on the hook to identify which of their benefits programs and transactions are the most susceptible to fraud schemes and to suggest some fraud prevention remedies. And the remedies outlined in this executive order are pretty extraordinary here. They said that in some cases, agencies may need to proactively pause certain types of funding until there are additional controls that can be put in place. The Trump administration has already done that to some effect. They recently paused hundreds of millions of dollars in Medicare payments to the state of Minnesota, citing widespread fraud concerns that they have highlighted. But that's a pretty extraordinary measure to preemptively say that all of this money is fraud and we have to close the spigot until we take a closer look at what's going on here. And then there are some other more conventional ideas here, really just making sure that there is some data sharing in place to make sure that agencies are doing all they can to flag and identify potentially fraudulent payments before they're paid out. That is the gold standard for any government CFO or IG that you speak to.
Jory, there's always been some tension in these kinds of benefit programs between making them easy for beneficiaries to use and access versus putting up high walls around accessibility that would help deter fraudsters. So have they said anything about where that balance is going to lie?
Well, that is a tricky balance, and we've seen in recent years some struggle to manage that balance. You saw back in 2020, some of the COVID pandemic relief programs, agencies were really focused on getting the money out the door above all else. And so there were fewer of those checks in place to make sure that they were doing all they could to mitigate fraud before payments were issued. That was one recent example. And another thing that comes to mind is, of course, the Department of Government Efficiency, something we saw in the earlier days of the Trump administration, where these DOJ officials came in, said that they were going to largely cut out fraud, waste, and abuse in government spending. They had an ambitious target as well. They were looking to get about $2 trillion in fraudulent and wasteful spending out of government. And if you take Elon Musk, his word for it, the former DOJ leader, he said that DOJ was somewhat successful at the end of last year and that DOJ ultimately cut somewhere in the neighborhood of about $200 billion in payments.
So as this fraud task force gets up and running, what other administration initiatives will they build on?
One other thing to think about here is what we saw last year is that the Trump administration signed an executive order trying to promote more of the data sharing between these agencies, trying to make sure there's greater coordination. One great example is the Treasury Department's Do Not Pay data set and the Social Security Administration's Death Master File. Those agencies now have more access to those data sets. They can cross-reference those to ultimately avoid sending improper payments to deceased individuals, people who, of course, no longer need those benefits. That's one major effort. And again, there was some concern about kind of where exactly the focus of this fraud task force will be, having mentioned things like the situation in Minnesota. Trump did try to get ahead of this a bit, saying that this is going to be a nationwide problem, that they're going to look at fraud in red states as well, if they have evidence of that being the case. But he did then immediately follow up and say that this is a problem that happens heavily in Democratic states. And the executive order does call out a number of states, such as California, Illinois, New York, Maine, Minnesota, and Colorado. So a bit of a mixed bag there.
Will the task force have a regular reporting schedule so that the public can find out how well they're doing?
There's not necessarily a sense of when the scheduled meetings will be, but you can expect a regular cadence of these agencies meeting, coordinating, comparing notes, seeing where the gaps are and where they need to go in order to bring this national strategy together and to do the kind of things that this executive order sets out to do.
That's Federal News Network's Jory Heckman. Jory, thanks for the story.
Thanks, Terry.
You can find the full details at federalnewsnetwork.com.